I'm going to put together a little Skillshare video, so I think it's a good time to take you on a little tour of my studio. All right, so this is my basic setup. Paper there, a watercolor palette there, the colors there, a paper towel is going to go here, my water's there, my brushes over here, my iPad right there. That is where I keep all my photo references. I'm going to be working on an orangutan. This light here is mostly to illuminate my hand when I'm painting, so it looks just a little bit nicer. This light here is the bright one. That illuminates the paper itself and everything. I've got a gooseneck where I've got my other phone charging and plugged in where I take my time lapses. And for now, what I'm doing is I've got a ring light over here just to illuminate myself a little bit more. And this camera set up over there. That's what's going to record this whole thing for this Skillshare. I'm going to paint an orangutan in 15 minutes. 5 minutes to sketch, 5 minutes to ink, and 5 minutes to paint. So, first thing I do is I start with a 4H pencil, something very hard and light, to make a light outline and a light sketch of what it is I'm doing. Just draw some basic shapes. This orangutan is very easy. I've got an iPad right up here with my photo reference, so I always work. I get my photo references from Pexels or Pixabay or Flickr. If you're interested in where I get my references, I can drop you some links for royalty-free stuff. It's pretty great. So step one, in the first 5 minutes, I'm just going to draw the outline of this orangutan. Pretty roughly, pretty simply, basic shapes to get it in, and then go in and refine the details. It's a pretty silly looking animal. The reference that I got for this has a lot of very direct light from above, so the shadows are pretty deep. One reason you might want to use pencils to sketch first is so you can erase them. It's pretty convenient if you make mistakes. I'm not concerned with mistakes, but I want things to be accurate. There's a quote from Miles Davis that says, "Do not fear mistakes, there are none." And I find that to be absolutely true. You can learn from your mistakes, if anything else. This is actually the second attempt at a tutorial video I've made because I completely botched the first one, but I learned a whole lot of things by messing it up the first time, which is super convenient. Now hopefully I won't mess up a second time. All right. Orangutans are very ridiculous looking animals. Look at this big wide face, just a bunch of strange ovals. You know? And I really lightly sketch in the fur. And first I drew the general shapes, and then I may erase some of those lines to make it a bit more detailed. So the general shapes make sure that the perspective and the proportions are all correct. And then you can go in and make sure you've got the details. Once the proportions are set, you can get into the details. And if you get into the details before you get all the proportions right, things just aren't going to look right at all. I don't know how much time is left in my timer, but I'm going to skip right ahead to my inking section because I'm pretty happy with how the pencils are right now. And I I'm feeling really loosey-goosey with this one. And again, this is just my process. I'm not saying anybody needs to do it this way. I'm just showing you how I do things. Sometimes I start right with this pen, and this is maybe a Fudensuke pen. It's a 0.35 millimeter. It's a very fine tip ink pen with water resistant ink. So after I do the inking here, the ink is not going to bleed. All right, so that's my timer telling me 5 minutes is up. Alexa, set a timer for 5 minutes.
5 minutes, starting now.
Alexa, stop timer. Alexa, set a timer for 5 minutes.
Second timer, 5 minutes, starting now.
All right, I may have like 3 timers going on right now. I don't even know. Okay, so inking this guy, going over the lines that I did. This is my preferred method most of the time. I get a lot of details in. One thing about me is that I learned to draw by just copying comic books. That's how I taught myself. And eventually I got to the point where I could draw on my own. I still almost always use a photo reference because I don't have everything in my brain yet. I need a reference to know what I'm doing. But that's why I draw as much as I do, so that hopefully, if anybody asks me to do an orangutan sometime, I'll be like, yeah, I know how to do that because I already did one. And then I can just like kind of crank it out. It's practice. Practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes better. There's no such thing as perfect. And this is where I make my mistakes on purpose because it's pretty dynamic. It creates these shapes that I kind of have to work with. I take these mistakes and I make them work. I fill them in, and it creates accidents sometimes that can be pretty cool. All right, next step is watercolor. I'm getting ahead of myself, but that is okay. Step 1 with the watercolor is I spray my palette a little bit just to activate the colors. Get them a little wet, makes them easier to mix up the colors correctly. All right, I'm gonna take this fine tip number 8 brush, and I'm gonna start putting some, let's say, some burnt umber in there. You know, and I'm gonna mix some burnt sienna in too. That's a pretty dominant color for this here gorilla. All right. So I'm creating a nice brown. The first thing I'm gonna do is paint in some shadows. Like I said, there's some very strong light coming from above. It creates some very deep shadows on Mr. Orangutan here, which is gonna make it fairly easy to just paint some shadows. And I could get away with just doing that. And in fact, in my 15-minute time limit, that might be all I have time for. But we shall see. So the first thing I'm doing, it's kind of counterintuitive to watercolor, it's actually painting in some shadows, painting in some accents. But you can tell that I'm not going like full dark. I'm not going black with these shadows because with watercolor, you kind of need to go light to dark. Alexa, stop timer. With watercolors, you need to go light to dark. Alexa, stop timer. Because you can't really watercolors are very translucent. You can't paint over top of them, whereas with oils or acrylics, you can paint other pigments, lighter pigments on top, so you can put in highlights. You have to remember the highlights with watercolor when you're starting. So one of the biggest things that I'm still trying to remember to learn is to not paint part of it. So the parts that I'm leaving white are going to be the highlights of everything. That's where the light is. Alexa, set a 5-minute timer.
5 minutes, starting now.
So a lot of times what I'm doing here is I keep on adjusting what's on my brush by rinsing it a little bit and painting and blending. So by doing that, I can create gradients here. And I can blend from dark to light, just basically blend it out just by adding water. And what I really want you to notice here is how frequently I dab the brush in water and onto the paper towel. So I'm gonna mix some burnt sienna and burnt umber in here to create a bit of a dynamic color. So it kind of gradates on its own in here. I use pure water on the brush to blend the darker tones that I've already put down into transparency onto the paper. What I did there is erase a little bit because there's a bit of an upper lip, the highlight that I want to keep in there of the upper lip. So I do not want to color that bit in. Minutes is just not really possible. What I am going to do is add some cerulean blue highlights because this gorilla is outside somewhere, and what's happening is his head is reflecting the sky. So the light that's on top of him is blue. I mean, his skin is black, but there are highlights in there. And those highlights have a blue tone to them. Alexa, stop. All right, so that was my 15 minutes, and I'm not even close to a place where I like this. So what I'm gonna do is finish up what I was working on, go pick my kid up from her dance class, come back when this is a little bit drier, and finish it later. But before I even do that, I do want to finish up what I was working on. Because the consistency of the wetness of the paper is one of the important things to think about when you're doing watercolor. So right now, I like how the colors are blending together, and it's working for me. And later on, when everything is dry, it'll be a very different way that these colors layer on top of each other. Not a bad way, but just different. What I am going to do actually is do a little bit of erasing, creating a highlight with my paper towel to erase a little bit of the color that I had in there. I don't know if I can do it up here. It might be too dry already. All right, that's good. So I created some highlights by dabbing it with the paper towel. Again, paper towel, absolute #1 watercolor tool. Basically an eraser. Alright, what I'm going to try to do for the rest of this video is a little bit of voiceover. In part because I did not record myself speaking anything for the rest of this video. So what I got going on here, I came back a while later, maybe even a day later, and I'm setting up some colors. I'm setting up the oranges. I'm setting up the warm tones in here. So what you can see, what I just did is I blended the colors that I like from my my pans into my palette and just kind of mixed it so that there's a bit of the bright orange and a bit of the brown together. So it's a bit of a dynamic color going on there. And I painted in there, and I get sloppy with what I do, but I also am trying to be mindful of the highlights and the shapes of this orangutan. It's almost like coloring by number, and then going in and filling in the details. This section right here, this part, is putting in the broad strokes of everything, filling in the base colors, and then being mindful of going light to dark. What's going to happen later on in this video is some really, really deep tones and sharper highlights of everything. Everything that you're watching right now is in double speed. So originally this video was over an hour long, and now it's about a half an hour long, which is fairly reasonable. And again, I wanted to make the whole thing in 15 minutes, but that didn't work out. One thing that's cool about watercolors is the brushes can make a whole bunch of different shapes. Like depending on how you put it down on the paper, you can create a super fine line or a very large wash of color with the same brush. What you want to look for in your brushes is a nice fine tip and something that when you clean it or after you use it doesn't become frayed, doesn't become like soft and just crappy after a while. What you see here is me putting some deep reds into the beard of this orangutan and just kind of letting it sit there and letting it bleed together. So you're starting to see deeper accents come into the orangutan here. And right now, like I said, I'm just working on the red tones, the warm tones, and I'll go back to the cool tones later on. The cool tones are mostly in the orangutan's skin, and the reds and oranges are its fur. So there, I used really light wash of color, like just a tiny little bit of orange on the brush to blend in the colors that I had already put down. So for a while, watercolor is workable, meaning that you can blend it a little bit. What I'm doing right now is I'm starting the purple. So I like to look at like the underlying tones of what is going on in my reference photo. So the blue is not the color of the skin. The purple is not really the color of the skin, but I can kind of pull that out. If I stare long enough, I can be like, all right, there's purple in there. But when you combine them all together, like the purple and the browns and the blues, it's going to create a black. It's going to create a shadow. And, I think I got a lot of that from just working in Photoshop for a long time and being able to separate the actual red, green, and blue or CMYK channels of objects I'm working on, and realizing what happens when you boost them up or take them down. And when you look at things that way, you can realize that in the shadows of elements, there are blues, there are reds. Looking at it from an artistic perspective, it is what the element is reflecting. It's all light. So if an angle on that gorilla is reflecting some darkness, some blues, or some purples from below, that's the color that you're going to want to put in. So what happens right around here is I kind of mess up the left eye of the orangutan. It's coming up. You'll see I sort of put a bit too much watercolor in there, and that doesn't look right at all. So I take my brush and I get it really wet, and I go in there and I kind of soak it up so it's not as deep. And then I take my paper towel and erase a little bit of that color, and then I even out the other eye. That was a mistake. I didn't want to do that, but you make it work. So what's good about watercolor is it is workable, but you kind of have to be quick because it does dry very fast. It's just water. But you can take your paper towel, again, absolutely the most important watercolor tool, and use it as an eraser. Frequently I go in and I put in like blobs of color, and then I take a really light brush and I blend it in. Like right there, I blended in that hard line that was on the area under his nose, and then use the paper towel again to like dab out a little bit of the color to create a more gentle gradient under his nose. The purple is adding a really great dynamic tone here. One thing that I consult pretty regularly is a simple color wheel, just to remember what colors are the opposites of colors I've already used. And one thing that is helpful for is creating shadows. So if you have an orange, or if you have a warm tone, if you look at the opposite side of that color wheel, whatever color is there is going to be the shadow of that color. It's going to create the biggest contrast, and it's going to create that line and that shape that's really going to pop by using color. You don't have to use black to create a shadow. You can use the opposite of whatever color you're already working on to create that shadow. I also want to note the really bad practice that I'm doing here with those water cups you see in the foreground. They're both like have the same kind of color in them. You're supposed to use one. I usually use the one on the bottom to rinse the brushes, so that's going to be like just dense, and the one on top is going to be like really, really not much color in it at all. Essentially, like rinse the brush off, rinse all the pigment off in one cup of water, and then use the other cup for some fresh water. Sometimes I break all of my rules and I make it work. I mean, it's sort of working right now because I need a bit of an orange, like adding a tiny like tincture of orange is okay here. Here I am starting again. You can notice that I have two brand new cups of clear water. And what I'm doing for this final bit of this orangutan is the shadows, like the darkest parts completely. So I'm mixing up a Payne's gray, and I think I was using some burnt umber in there. So this creates black essentially, and this is where I go in and I add the blacks to everything. And the details. I'm using a much finer tipped brush. Not super fine because I still need to fill in some large areas of color. So I may be using like a 4 or a 6 with a pretty fine tip. So this gives me the time and the opportunity to create lots of finer details to really pull this whole thing together. So you're gonna see some kind of kludgy looking work in here. Like those hairs, that doesn't look great, but don't worry. I'm gonna go into it with uh, a brush with much less pigment on it and blend it all together. But I create these bits, these accents, and blend it in and leave tiny little peaks of color or peaks of the underlying layer through, because that then creates a highlight. So as I'm drawing in the shadows, I'm leaving space not painted that creates a highlight. You can see it in the blue on the orangutan's face. That was planned from the very beginning, that blue is the highlight. So later on, thinking ahead, I'm just going to leave that blue alone to create the highlight of the orangutan. A lot of this detail work gets pretty boring to watch at full speed, so I'm going to speed it up even more. This is 5x. So obviously all of this takes me much longer to do. This whole video is about half an hour, about 28 minutes right now. And in reality, this whole thing probably took me about an hour. This is the closest to real time I've done any kind of video. But the point is, because I wanted to show you more real time what it's like to do a painting. That being said, an hour plus is a long time to watch a video. So I'm going to do a little bit more VO as we go through this. So as you see, I am just blocking in some chunks of darkness, chunks of shadow, and then I go back in with a wetter brush with not very much pigment on it and blend it in. And again, I really want to reiterate, you may have seen like 3 or 4 different paper towels on my screen here. Paper towel I use absolutely constantly. I dip the brush, I pull some pigment in, and I regulate how much color, how much pigment is on that brush by dabbing on the paper towel. Sometimes I want a lot of color. Sometimes I don't want a lot of color, and I just want a little bit and just a lot of wetness. So that paper towel is what I use to regulate how much is on the brush. Again, it's something, it takes a feel, it takes a lot of practice. But yeah, don't sleep on the paper towel. It's absolutely the most important watercolor tool. Okay, so there's about 1 minute left in this little tutorial video Skillshare. So I just want to say thank you. If you're actually still watching this, let me know, because I will be startled and staggered if you are. And thanks. This is my first attempt of doing this, so if it's too long-winded, unfocused, I have absolutely no idea. But for me, this is a lot of practice, not only in just creating watercolors, but also explaining it and trying to talk through it. I can do it. I can create the watercolor, but actually explaining what I do is different. So these are the final touches, really blending stuff in, creating the shadows, giving it some depth, and that's it. I hope you guys like my orangutan. Thank you.